Something has came across my feed recently, and it's discussion about how the Nephilim, which are offspring of fallen angels from the Old Testament in the Bible, actually looked like clowns. The connection seems to imply that clowns as we know them today are actually a caricature, or some other physical interpretation, of these Old Testament giants. Before I start to explain the arguments for and against this theory, I would like to state that there is a book on this issue by Paul Stobbs that goes much deeper into the topic than I will. In fact, this entire video will be responding to or explaining some points made by Stobbs in his book. So what are the Nephilim? The Nephilim can briefly be explained as giants, who are the offspring of fallen angels and humans that appear in the Old Testament before the Great Flood. It is shown in the Old Testament and in extra-canonical texts such as the Book of Enoch that the Great Flood was done by God because he saw that angels, referred to as sons of God, were having children with human women. There are also some verses in the Bible that are argued to discuss the Nephilim after the Great Flood. The Nephilim only appear twice in the canonical Old Testament, once in the book of Genesis and again in the book of Numbers. In Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4, the Bible states that, quote, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, these were mighty men of old, men of renown." In Numbers chapter 13 verse 33, the Bible states that, "There we saw them, the Nephilim, who were the sons of Enoch, who came from the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." The Hebrew word for Nephilim comes from the root word nephal, which means to fall. The word can translate to the fallen ones or those who cause others to fall. In some Greek translations, Nephilim is also translated as gigantes, meaning giants. The Book of Enoch details that a group of 200 angels, called the Watchers, descended to earth on Mount Hermon. These Watchers took human wives and fathered giant offspring who were the Nephilim. The Nephilim were said to devour humans, teach forbidden arts like sorcery, and take other actions that would further corrupt humanity. I want to take a moment here to state that I am not a biblical scholar and that the Book of Enoch is considered extra-canonical text, meaning that it doesn't appear in any popular Bible translation like the NLT, KJV, etc. The clown connection. So what I'm going to do first is explain the connection between clowns and the Nephilim in a very simplistic, bare-bones, detail-lacking manner. Keep in mind that most of this information is going to come from Stobbs' writings. We will get more in depth into this connection, but for now, here's a very skeletonized view. 1. The Nephilim existed as enormous, terrifying, intelligent, evil hybrid beings with monstrous and exaggerated human features. 2. Human fear and survival response to these monstrous beings leaves cultural imprints such as rituals, myths, and costumes, etc. 3. Modern clown aesthetics have exaggerated, distorted human features like oversized shoes, walking on stilts so as to appear inhumanly tall, and hyperbolic human colors such as pale white face with bright red lips. 4. Each clown feature is then inferred to be matched to a supposed Nephilim attribute. 5. Circuses are not just entertainment, but are instead ritualized forms of Nephilim worship or remembrance that are derived from ancient practices of engagement with otherworldly beings. Secret societies in particular carry this format forward as well. 6. The pervasive presence of clown imagery in horror and other media is seen as evidence of the archetype's power, implying that it taps into some deeper sort of genetic memory in humans. 7. So now, the modern clown is a purposeful caricature or some other type of manifestation of the ancient Nephilim. So now you're probably wondering, where did Stobbs get a physical description of the Nephilim from? One source we've already discussed, the Book of Enoch, details that they were giant, predatory, human-angel hybrids. Another source is the ancestor spirit in the worldwide folk ritual costumes that have a recurring design of pale faces, horns or points on the nose, neck ruffs, oversized appendages, and bright colors. The implication is that these are cultural echoes of how the Nephilim looked, even though that specific culture might not have referred to them as the Nephilim, they were exposed to them all the same. Stobbs also makes the connection of circus rings and the clowning rituals of Masonic societies like the Royal Order of Jesters and the ancient Free Accepted Masons, as well as the Free and Accepted Masons Lodge. Another source that I've seen during my own research are the DMT Jesters, as described in Trip Report lore. I don't want to get too deep into the Jesters and DMT in this video, I just want to state that some people include this as a connection. The idea can roughly be described as the Nephilim's physical bodies died, so they now exist and rule in some sort of non-understood spirit realm, and that these Jesters are seen during breakthrough DMT trips, which are actually Nephilim. Thus, tying together the Nephilim equals clowns dynamic. I could be wrong about this, and if I am, please let me know in the comments. A connection to the Freemasonic Lodge is also used by Stobbs to explain the clown tying to the Nephilim dynamic. The claim is that a popular composer and playwright named Charles Dibdin was a Freemason, and that himself and Charles Dibdin Jr. traveled the East together, particularly in India. Sometime after the two came back from their travels, Charles Dibdin Jr. started working on pantomimes in his theatrical works, and essentially replaced the current interpretation of a harlequin, or clown, as we know it, with his own interpretation. I could go into explaining what stock characters are, but for now, just kind of imagine that Charles Dibdin Jr. replaced this thing called a stock character with his own version, which is the modern clown. It was at this point that the clown went from wearing plain clothing to wearing the bright, psychedelic colors associated with modern clowns. Charles Dibdin Jr. then hired Joseph Grimaldi at the Sadler's Wells Theater, where Grimaldi wore many of Charles Jr.'s modern clown costumes. It is after this moment that the design of the clown would go only towards Charles Dibdin Jr.'s design and would never return to the original Harlequin format, and that goes for theaters even outside of the ones that Charles Dibdin Jr. had influence in. It should be noted that there is an Indian interpretation of a demon called the Kala Sung Sang, and that Charles Jr.'s clown's interpretation appeared very similar to the paintings of this demon. Kala Sung Sang translates literally to upside demon, and there are many artworks in which Grimaldi's appearance in some of Charles Jr.'s pantomimes seems to intentionally mimic the artwork of the Kala Sung Sang. The implication with this seems to be that Charles Dibdin Sr. was a Freemason, giving the occult and mystery connection, that Charles Dibdin Jr. made his pantomime that would become the modern clown using inspiration from physical attributes from a demon, and finally, that this pantomime would become the modern clown with ease because of some form of occult control over the theater industry at the time, or because of the demonic forces within the pantomime itself. Or it could be both. Another implication, at least from my interpretation of his writings, is that the pantomime creation was some form of worship or allegiance to the demon. The counter-argument. The primary issue that most people would see here is that the connection is made through implication and circumstance. The statement of clowns being modeled after the Nephilim also relies heavily on mystery and the implication that there's some greater, secret society that knows the intricate details of everything mentioned previously, and that they are doing all of this out of some form of demon worship or to push their own agenda. However, we don't know exactly what that agenda is, so we have to only use circumstance and guesswork. The issue here is that none of this actually explains the connection of the clowns to the Nephilim in a manner that isn't some form of, hey look, these things kinda seem like the same thing. Another issue is that we don't have an actual physical description of the Nephilim in biblical text other than they were giants. What this means is that all of the ancestor spirit connections made to the Nephilim are in some way guesswork. Just because there were cultures in the modern and ancient world that had some form of ritual and history surrounding evil spirits doesn't mean that those evil spirits were the Nephilim in the Old Testament. Without some kind of actual account, such as a painting, ancient text, etc., detailing what the Nephilim actually looked like from the period in which they walked the earth, all of these cultures having similar costumes or face paint to represent evil spirits can be something entirely different from the Nephilim in the Bible. I also haven't been able to find any sort of concrete evidence that Charles Dibdin Jr. and Joseph Grimaldi's development of Joey the Clown, as I found he was called, was done out of esoteric ritualism. Particularly, the stage comedy of the clown and its development doesn't mention some sort of ritual motive or otherworldly intervention. The theatrical roots of commedia dell'arte in the 1500 Italy already used whiteface, slapstick trickery humor, and other clown-like features for their stock full characters before Charles Dibdin Jr.'s reimagination of the, aesthetic of the clown. I would like to take a moment to say that a lot of evidence used by Stobbs seems to be Christian rhetoric from extra-canonical or Old Testament text and personal accounts of DMT trips. The issue I have here as a Christian is that doing drugs so as to commune or understand the other side and Christianity don't go together at all. As a matter of fact, doing that is specifically listed as a sin in the Bible. The premise that Stobbs used here relies a lot on what is called a false cause fallacy. Basically, the idea here is that these two things look alike, so one probably comes from another. I'm not saying that this isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility and that they are connected in some way. However, the evidence provided by Stobbs in his book doesn't really prove anything. And before anyone starts with anything like, well, it's just his interpretation, or well, it's just our theory, I think that we should refer back to the title of Stobbs' book, The Nephilim Looked Like Clowns, which is obviously a statement of fact. The argument in his book frequently jumps from one unproven point to another, since we know X, therefore Y, before establishing the first premise. By stacking assumptions, kind of how he goes, we know the biblical evidence, when it's never actually demonstrated in the book, the reasoning becomes circular. Each new layer of his argument depends on the last one being true, yet none are verified in the book. Treating every mythological or cryptid legend as literal proof of Nephilim hybrids ignores how cultures independently create similar stories to explain natural fears and chaos. I guess what I'm saying is that shared symbols don't prove a shared ancestry or shared experience. They do prove shared humanity, however. Where research becomes interesting is not in declaring that the Nephilim were clowns, but comparing how different cultures portray mischievous, hybrid, jester-like spirits or trickster motifs. The cross-cultural reappearance of the trickster is real and worthy of study. Exploring those parallels as psychological or archetypal phenomena would make a stronger, more credible argument than claiming some sort of genetic fear from fallen angels. What I personally think. Well, I know what I'm going to say here might be a little bit radical and might upset some people, but I think that we should consider that not every shower thought turns out to be true, and that not every conspiracy turns out to be the true narrative. I'm not going to pretend like the similarities aren't there and that there isn't some sort of strange coincidental artwork. I do find it interesting how killer clowns from outer space could be a euthanized version of Nephilim fallen from heaven. We could also add that Pennywise is a demonic clown, which could be a nod to Nephilim appearing as clowns theory. The movie The Mask being vaguely similar to the ideas presented earlier. The list of clown-adjacent characters or titles that could somehow tie back to demons, which could then somehow tie back to the Nephilim, isn't going to be listed in its entirety in this video. Also, there's John Wayne Gacy. The issue is that just because there are similarities, circumstantial naming, and cultures, and a guy whose dad was a Freemason as well, doesn't really mean that the theory is irrevocably true. What is true is that there is no ancient biblical, extra-canonical, or biblical adjacent text that describes the Nephilim's physical appearance beyond being giants. If we look outside of biblical text for description of the Nephilim, we end up looking at something that might not even be talking about the Nephilim. It is interesting that a bunch of different cultures around the world dress up similar to what modern clowns look like, that these caricatures they dress up as are representations of evil spirits, and that this tradition was passed on and refined. The issue is that without an actual biblical description of the Nephilim beyond they were giants, we cannot have anything to compare to in order to make the statement the Nephilim looked like clowns. Believers in the idea that Charles Dibdin Jr. preserved the Nephilim appearance inside of his pantomimes that would become the modern clown might say that there isn't any documented evidence of this because of the ties to the Freemasonic Lodge's real version of history that is hidden from outsiders. So now, the lack of evidence becomes proof of concealment. That logic kind of short-circuits reason. It assumes an all-powerful organization that both controls every cultural symbol and leaves no trace of its control still allows those symbols to appear publicly. I'm not saying that there aren't mainstream history narratives that are cover-ups by the Freemasonic Lodge or some other secret order, or that there isn't a hidden truth in many aspects of human history that is being controlled or concealed by secret societies. I'm just saying that I don't think this is one of them. The deeper problem with this reasoning is that it makes itself impossible to test. Having the concept of, well, of course they kept it secret, so that's why there's no proof, is a self-sealing argument. It can never be tested or proven wrong because every counterexample becomes part of the conspiracy. That's not really an investigation. It treats ordinary coincidences and stylistic evolution as evidence of some invisible hand, while dismissing all contradictory data in its deliberate misdirection. The record we can actually examine is that European stage traditions, fashion history, and the documented rise of the pantomime already do explain the clown's appearance without invoking some sort of hidden master. Before I end this discussion entirely, I would like to state the following. I don't agree with the statement the Nephilim looked like clowns. I also don't think that it can be proven beyond a doubt. However, I do agree with Stobbs' pattern of thought. I think it's important to find new ideas, coincidences, and hidden truths. It's this kind of thinking that moves people forward towards what is real and what is false, and ultimately brings us closer to God, who has given us an inquisitive, intelligent mind. Consider this. The concept of Pangea initially existed because people saw that Africa and the Americas could fit together, almost like a puzzle. In similar fashion, Stobbs has found one thing that looks similar to another and has formed his theory. What I'm saying is, he could be right after all, but I just don't buy it. So that's where I'll leave it. I know this topic hits that strange middle ground between myth and mystery, and people see patterns in different ways, so maybe I'm missing something. What do you all think? Am I wrong? Am I right? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how you all see it, and I'm open to being told that I'm wrong. Thank you.